I will touch upon a different issue, which is what is the exact content of the right to housing in international and European law. And before embarking on the perspective of discussing what are the contemporary issues of the right to housing, I think it's quite useful to start reflecting on a preliminary question, which is the right to housing a right? And is it a human right? An obvious reply coming from an audience of distinguished specialists of housing issues is yes. And it goes without saying that I entirely agree with this reply. But let us be realistic. The vast majority of distinguished human rights lawyers would probably reply no. And of course, they all agree that all human rights are, and I quote, universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. I quote from the Vienna Declaration of 1993. But what do those words entail in practice? And some people would reply, not much. I invite you to be more optimistic and to say, not enough. Indeed, the claims for indivisibility have progressively changed the impact of social rights as human rights and the way they are treated at international and national level. Within the United Nations, and we know Professor Gerard Quinn is extremely active within the UN organization, over the past years, several important treaties were adopted, or existing treaties were improved by the addition of optional protocols. In Europe today, the European Union's Charter of Fundamental Rights is now in force, and within the Council of Europe I'm representing today, I think it's fair to say that the European Social Charter is now well known and constitutes a rather efficient tool for ensuring the respect of social rights. It's also fair to say that more significant results have been achieved in other continents, and we should pay tribute to the jurisprudence of courts in India, in South Africa, in South American countries, which all should inspire Europe. So by contrast to this very uncertain link between housing and human rights, we all know the importance of housing in everyone's life, and we've heard the previous speaker and also all the introduction today. Housing bears a specific importance for the functioning of every social service in all countries at national and regional level. And this brings us back to the root of the issue. Housing is linked to the very heart of human dignity, and therefore it is an essential component of human rights. Thomas Hammarberg, the former Council of Europe's Commissioner on Human Rights, used to say that political and civil rights can hardly be exercised by people who are denied basic economic and social rights. And amongst those social rights, the right to housing bears a specific importance because of its multiple dimensions. Firstly, it's truly a human right, but also housing is a place, and we heard that from Le Corbusier, it's a place where other rights are exercised, including the right to privacy, the right to family life. And we all know the importance which is attached by the European Court of Human Rights on the principle of inviolability of home. Another dimension of housing is that dwelling is also a prerequisite condition to exercise other rights, such as we know all voting rights, but maybe also right to health. Another dimension is that the right to housing applies to everyone, but is of particular importance for persons belonging to disadvantaged sections of the population. And therefore, the right to housing should be granted without discrimination, particularly against Roma people, against persons belonging to minorities, against persons in a situation of poverty or social exclusion, or risking social exclusion. So my intention is to try and explain what the European Social Charter brings into the debate. I'll start by the creation of the Council of Europe, which is, I recall, an organization created in 1949, and today 47 European countries are member states of the Council of Europe. That is practically all European countries, not all, but practically all of them. And the first achievement of the Council of Europe is the adoption in 1950 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which created the well-known European Court of Human Rights. But those rights in the Convention are only civil and political rights, are mainly civil and political rights. And the Council of Europe adopted 11 years later, in 1961, the European Social Charter, which is, as Professor Quinn mentioned, a binding treaty, exactly like the European Convention on Human Rights, which provides for economic and social rights, but unfortunately established a rather weak control mechanism. There is no European Court on social rights. There is a committee, the European Committee of Social Rights, which is composed of 15 independent experts whose task is to assess whether countries respect their obligations under the Charter. In other words, whether citizens enjoy their rights in their respective countries. Professor Quinn was a member of that committee some years ago, and this committee is becoming more and more important in Europe today. This is because the Charter was amended. It was updated in 1996 in order to reinforce its control mechanism, but also to update the rights which are part of the Charter. And one of the major improvements of the Social Charter in 1996 was the addition of one specific provision on the right to housing. That is Article 31 of the revised Social Charter. I will read out that text. It's very nicely phrased. Everyone has the right to housing. With a view to ensuring the effective exercise of the right to housing, the parties undertake to take measures designed, first, to promote access to housing of an adequate standard. Secondly, to prevent and reduce homelessness with a view to its gradual elimination. And thirdly, to make the price of housing accessible to those without adequate resources. Very nice words, but what does it mean in practical terms? Well, the committee is in charge of checking the situation of all countries having accepted Article 31, and I confirm that for the time being, Ireland has not yet accepted Article 31. And countries are reporting on how they implement their obligations in practice. But there is also a second control mechanism known as the collective complaints procedure, whereby trade unions and NGOs may lodge an appeal before the European Committee of Social Rights when they consider that a country is not respecting its obligations. And amongst the 82 complaints registered since the beginning of the system in 1998, amongst those 82 complaints, about 20 concerned directly or indirectly the right to housing. Currently, 15 states have accepted the collective complaint system, amongst which Ireland and other European states. So the Committee of Social Rights has developed a case law which interprets and explains Article 31. And that is what I will try to present now. This interpretation of Article 31 relies on three pillars. The first one is definitions of the words of the provision. The second one is modalities of implementation by states. And the third one is very specific situations relating to the right to housing. I will come back to each aspect. Firstly, the definition. What do the words I just read out of Article 31 mean? Well, firstly, a decent housing means that the quality of each dwelling must be of a sufficient level to respect dignity of individuals who occupy it. And that means that the accommodation should have all the basic amenities: water, heating, garbage disposal, sanitation, electricity, etc. But it also means that some risk factors should be under control, such as lead or asbestos. It also means that the dwelling should not be overcrowded. That is to say that its size should be adapted to the number of members and persons composing the household living in that dwelling. But it also means that there should be a legal guarantee of tenure to ensure that the real enjoyment of a dwelling is not temporary, but there is a fair and legally guaranteed perspective for the persons living there to remain in the dwelling. These are the dimensions that the Committee of Social Rights included in the notion of adequate housing. There are also quantitative aspects. Since the aim of the Social Charter is that everyone should enjoy a home, the issue of homelessness should be addressed. And there should be firstly prevention of homelessness, in the sense that eviction should be regulated. There can be no eviction without any right to appeal before a court. There can be no eviction conducted without respecting the dignity of the persons involved. But for those who are homeless, there must also be measures in order to take emergency measures and provide immediate shelter. Again, several conditions must be respected, like the respect of dignity at any stage. But what is very important is that the provision of a shelter should be seen as a very temporary and immediate measure, but not as a solution of the problem, which requires long-term solutions. I'm turning now to the financial aspects, and I will be less detailed than in the previous presentation. There must be efforts carried by states in order to reduce the costs when part of the population cannot access through the market a decent dwelling. So that entails promotion of construction, reduction of the waiting period in order to access social housing, and also financial assistance for those in need. Actually, all those definitions I'm referring to were elaborated by the Committee of Social Rights thanks to cases, collective complaints, brought to the committee by several NGOs, and in particular by FEANSA, and the very famous FEANSA case against France paved the way for those very important and concrete definition. What is very important to consider for the collective complaints procedure is that the decision of the Committee of Social Rights, although it's binding, has no immediate and direct effect at national level. And there is a need for the organizations or for citizens to actively rely on the decisions of the Committee of Social Rights when they are suing owners or even the state before national courts. They must push national courts to follow the interpretation of the Charter given by the European Committee of Social Rights in order to ensure that these decisions do not remain theoretical. The second dimension of the case law are the modalities of implementation. And the Committee of Social Rights spent a long time to explain states how they should consider the European Social Charter by insisting on its human rights dimension first, but also by insisting that being a concrete and practical instrument, it should lead the states parties to take legal and practical measures in order to meet the objectives of the right to housing. There is under Article 31 of the Social Charter no obligation of results, of immediate results, but states should undertake a strategy firstly by assessing the needs and the situation and by defining an action plan in order to meet with the objectives of the Charter in a reasonable time. They should use all available budgetary and financial possibilities in order to respect the right under Article 31. And what is extremely important is that states should also pay particular attention on the impact of their policy choices on all categories concerned. And in particular, when they decide to have a sort of priority for one group, they should be very attentive to the consequence of other parts of the population. Again, action by NGOs, action by trade unions at national level is extremely important to ensure that those principles are translated into the reality. There is no single solution, and that is applicable to the right to housing, but to every right under the Social Charter. The Committee of Social Rights will never tell the states exactly what they have to do, because there is a discretion of the state on how they proceed in order to combine the principles, the definition, the objective of the Charter, and translate all that into concrete measures at national level. An interesting issue is that experiences such as the Welsh legislation or the French legislation, according to which there is a concrete right to housing for every citizen, firstly, are not an obligation under the European Social Charter. There are other means of implementing Article 31 at national level. But secondly, the French system was heavily criticized by the Committee of Social Rights because of the insufficiency of the progress made, despite a very clear legislation granting every individual a right to access to a court, which is empowered to grant a dwelling to persons in need, but actually there are no sufficient possibilities at local level to provide for dwellings. And this reminds me the important sentence of Milun Kotari, who was the UN Special Representative on the right to housing, who used to say that probably because he was an architect, because he is an architect himself, he said that the right to housing is too important to be left to lawyers, and that's an issue of architects, because the basics is building more dwellings. So I turn now to the third aspect of that case law, which are the specific issues relating to right to housing. Of course, all those definitions and modalities of implementations that I was referring to are applicable to everyone, but there are very specific situations, which again were brought to the attention of the committee through collective complaints. And I'm referring to the issue of housing rights in respect of the Roma and travelers population. There has been several complaints against Italy, Greece, France, Portugal, Bulgaria, Belgium, not Ireland, not yet Ireland, not Ireland, concerning housing rights of the Roma and travelers. And actually the committee found violations in several countries because of their poor living conditions in camps, because of the insufficient number of stopping places for travelers, because of the way evictions were carried out without respecting the dignity of persons concerned, and because of the absence of legal remedies. Actually, for the first time, the Committee of Social Rights found what it called aggravated violations of the European Social Charter in two cases, one against Italy and one against France. And what the committee understands by aggravated violation is a situation whereby, firstly, a group of the population is targeted as the victims of the violation of the social charter. But secondly, there is either positive action by public authorities which leads to the violation, or passivity by public authorities in front of the violation. And for those two cases, one against Italy, one against France, the committee considered that those two criteria were met and there was an aggravated violation. Another aspect important in Europe today, which is different from the issue of the rights of Roma and travelers, is the issue of IDP, internally displaced persons. And there was a case against Croatia in that respect. According to CORE, the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions, there were violations of the social charter because part of the ethnic Serb population in Croatia that was displaced during the war were subjected to discriminatory treatment because they could not turn back to Croatia and access to their previous dwellings. And the committee actually found a violation of the social charter, but only in respect of those persons who either expressed their wish to turn back to Croatia, but could not do so, or turn back to Croatia, but could not access social housing. In other words, the social charter applies to those who are living in the country concerned, not to those who are living abroad. Another very important issue concerns Slovenia, and the case was brought by the International Federation of Human Rights, and it concerned the modalities of denationalization of housing. The legislation in Slovenia concerned, sorry, I mentioned the International Federation of Human Rights, but FENSA was also behind that case. Sorry, it was FENSA who brought that case. The condition under which the legislation provided for the changing from a system of communist type of property to private property of housing was criticized in the sense that the rights of the different persons concerned were not respected in a proportionate way. The last example before I reach my conclusion, concerned the Netherlands, and it was a case brought by Defence for Children International, and it was the issue of children in an irregular situation who do not enjoy the right to housing, and the committee considered that the social charter does not provide for a right to housing for those in an illegal situation, but only, but that's quite important, for a right to a shelter. So having covered all these cases interpreting Article 31, I would like to come to the conclusion according to which, first of all, we should encourage all European states to ratify the European Social Charter. For the time being, 43 states have done so, and I'm always happy to give the names of the 4 countries who have not yet ratified: Switzerland, Liechtenstein, Monaco, and San Marino. Secondly, all countries should accept Article 31, and I will not give you the list of those who have not done so because it's too long. And thirdly, all countries should accept the collective complaints procedure, because accepting a right without granting NGOs the possibility to challenge the implementation of the right is not enough. Thanks to those complaints and the work done by NGOs, including and in particular FEANSA, the Committee of Social Rights has now explained the principles which have to be respected, the rights and how they should be implemented. So what remains to be done now is to define country per country a strategy for the years ahead and to constantly review the needs of the population. I'm convinced that our conference today will contribute to this process of defining these strategies, and I'm very grateful for the organizers to give me this opportunity to talk about the European Social Charter. Thank you very much.